Tonight, we're going to have a little bit more conversation on how we, as advocates, as people who are well aware, and as well as talking with our state elected leaders, how we can continue making sure that the projects that are being put forth are thoughtful, because we are at an inflection point where all this money is going to be very dependent on how we advocate for it. And we can't let this money just go straight to highways or road construction projects that, a lot of different departments of transportations might be looking at. We got to make sure that we are thinking about racial equity in the projects that we're proposing. We're thinking about how do we create clean transportation resources and make accessible public transportation as well. And through all this, layering all that piece is making sure that we have high labor standards as we come up with these solutions, because we know that the reason why we're here in this climate crisis is a lot of longstanding decisions that have been made throughout the years. And as we're looking for solutions, we really have to land on how we work together in identifying the solutions that work best for everyone. So it is why we're here tonight. And we're going to have a great conversation. Jumping ahead a little bit. And I want to thank our host, State Senator Mike Simmons, and our panelists that you'll hear from tonight, including Obai Reed from Equiticity, Kyle Whitehead from Active Transportation Alliance, Brian Urbacheski from the Respiratory Health Association, Susan Mudd from the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and Madison Lyle from Warehouse Workers for Justice. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our senator to get us started.
Well, thank you so much, Danny, for kicking us off this evening. I want to say thank you to everyone for making time to join us this evening as we talk about this important topic and hear from awesome experts and advocates on this call to discuss clean transportation and the future of public transit. As a lifelong user of public transit, and someone that cycles just about everywhere, I'm especially geeked out for tonight's panel. I'm looking forward to hearing some of the expertise of our panelists and looking forward to hearing some questions from the community. Specifically, I want to thank our panelists, Obai from Equiticity, President and CEO, Madison Lyle from the Warehouse Workers for Justice, Brian Urbacheski from the Respiratory Health Association and Director of Environmental Health Programs, Danny Robles, of course, who kicked us off and is the Chicago Energy Policy Coordinator for the Illinois Environmental Council, Susan Mudd, the Senior Policy Advocate with the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and Kyle Whitehead, who is the Managing Director of Public Affairs for the Active Transportation Alliance. I am State Senator Mike Simmons, representing the 7th District of the Illinois State Senate, which includes the Chicago neighborhoods of all or in part of Rogers Park, Lincoln Square, Edgewater, Andersonville, Ravenswood, Bowmanville, where I live in Uptown, West Ridge, and a little bit of the southern part of Evanston. I was born in Lincoln Square, lifelong resident of this community. I'd like to tell people I grew up in scattered site public housing and very interested in seeing the future of this country going in a better direction in terms of public housing and green revisions of public housing. And I also am a small business owner. On transportation, as I said earlier, I am an avid supporter of public transit and biking. And I really am excited to hear from our advocates tonight. I'm also on the transportation committee. I like to mention that also, and want to position myself as somebody that can be an advocate for transit equity in years to come. And then most recently, took some action with a number of my colleagues in the state Senate. We wrote a letter, which is attached as a written statement to the CTA, asking the CTA and the board to in their proposed 2022 to 2026 capital program projects to accelerate the timeline to include electric fleet for the entire Chicago Transit Authority, asking them to do that by 2030 instead of 2040. And so, I mention that because I'm excited to support the current work and activism that's being led by the community. It's being led by advocates such as those that we have on the call tonight. And as elected official, I think that it's really important that that it be our job to add pressure to the systems and support activists and organization and pushing for progress. So on that note, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, who centers equity in all of his work, Olatunji Obai Reed.
Right. Thank you, Illinois Senator Mike Simmons. I've watched you up close and from afar, and it's an honor to be a part of your town hall this evening. Thank you again. All right. My name is Obai Olatunji Obai Reed. I am the founding president and CEO of the Equiticity Racial Equity Movement. This evening's presentation is titled Goofy Smiles and Awkward Handshakes, Operationalizing Racial Equity in Transportation. Next. Our agenda, we'll talk a little bit about the Equiticity Racial Equity Movement. I'll share some thoughts on a few principles which make up a commitment to racial equity, including community ownership, racially equitable traffic enforcement, racial equity scooter prescriptions, supporting community mobility rituals and neighborhood mobility hubs. And then I'll share a little bit about our Equiticity Racial Equity Statement of Principle and the dichotomy between legislation and good hearts, and share my contact info before we adjourn. Next. The Equiticity Racial Equity Movement. Equiticity is operationalizing racial equity by harnessing our collective power through research, advocacy, programs, and community mobility rituals to improve the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in our society, both here in Chicago and cities across the country. Next. One of the first elements of a commitment to racial equity is community ownership. The transportation and planning sectors, both in the region, in the state, even throughout the country, is racist. It has a racist origin story, it has a racist lineage, and its implementation on a contemporary basis is racist. Who should own the planning process? Is it white people, bureaucrats, capitalists who don't understand the needs of Black and Brown communities? Or is it Black and Brown people at the neighborhood level, community-based organizations living and working in our neighborhoods? We believe the planning process for transportation must be owned at the neighborhood level by Black and Brown people. It doesn't mean agencies are boxed out. Agencies have resources to bring to bear, they have expertise, and they have parameters that we need to fit in. However, the ownership of the planning process must rest in our neighborhoods. Next. Racially equitable traffic safety. I'm gonna be talking about racism a lot in this few minutes of presentation. And one unfortunate reality is that the system of policing is racist and harmful with respect to Black and Brown people in our region and throughout the state. So we are advocating for racially equitable traffic safety, which removes policing from low-level traffic stops. It bans police from making bicycle stops and issuing jaywalking tickets. We are looking for other mechanisms, other community-led strategies to improve traffic violence and not relying on a police enforcement strategy. We also are advocating for equitable investments in engineering, where we are re-engineering our streets to make them safer. I'll give you a quick example. The intersection of 79th and Stony Island and South Chicago is one of the most dangerous intersections in the state of Illinois. And it's been that way for many generations. And that intersection hasn't undergone any wholesale re-engineering. And likely since my grandfather was coming up here in Chicago. Next. Racial equity scooter prescriptions. We are still living down the legacy of how Divvy here in Chicago, our bike share system, landed in our market. They ignored Black and Brown neighborhoods, and they were proud of it. And they justified it for economic reasons. Economics were the reason that they ignored our neighborhoods. Economics were the reason that they executed a racist strategy in our city. We've seen economics as justification for racism before. We called it slavery. We do not want to go down the same path with a permanent scooter program here in Chicago. We want racial equity to be operationalized in a permanent scooter program. A few of the things we're advocating for is a reinvestment of 66% of scooter revenue that the city generates going back into predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. We want racially equitable metrics to be targeted for the scooter operators and not rely on geographic deployment of scooters. Those when scooters just sit in our neighborhoods, they become furniture. We're not interested in furniture. We're interested in mobility. We want to see metrics such as ridership, improved life outcomes, important destinations to achieving life outcomes. These are some of the measures. These are some of the elements of a racially equitable scooter program that we're advocating for. Next. So largely in the US, the model of cycling that has been adopted in this country is a European model. It comes from cities that are racially homogenous, that lean socialist, that don't have the same level of racism or violence in those countries and in those cities. And we've been duped into believing that that's an appropriate model for our city to be implemented in our neighborhoods. We disagree. There's other models. The European model is a model that prioritizes bikes as a form of transportation, targeting commuters. It's reflected in a focus on infrastructure. It's reflected in bike share systems, the pricing, the distribution of stations. All of that reflects that European model. We don't believe in that model. And in fact, I'm confident that model has failed Black and brown neighborhoods. There's another model that we believe in. It's born out of South America, the Ciclovia model, where the focus is on socialization. The focus is on using bikes as a tactical vehicle to improve lives, to reduce violence, improve health, and create jobs. And one element of that work that we're executing in many organizations, both here in Chicago and around the state, is doing community bicycle rides to socialize people around the activity of cycling. We need financial support for that work. Right now, the transportation sector is only focused on funding infrastructure. We call it hardware. We need support for community mobility rituals. We call it software. Next. Another type of work that requires resources is neighborhood mobility hubs. Neighborhood mobility hubs take the traditional mobility hub model, which has been implemented in this country and some cities around the country. It's been implemented in other parts of the world as well, especially in Europe. However, it reimagines it when the target audience is Black and brown, living in a low to moderate income neighborhood with severe transportation inequities. The neighborhood mobility hub model concentrates the infrastructure and the hardware that we need to grow our mobility and pairs it with community mobility rituals. And then there's a physical space where people can come and engage and work on their mobility in a protected, safe space. That space also serves as a vehicle to address trauma. Mobility in our neighborhoods come with trauma. We are deeply concerned about violence. And there's three types of violence we're concerned about: interpersonal, vehicular, and police. All three impact our mode choice, and we have to begin to address that. Next. Our equiticity racial equity statement of principle is available on our website. It goes through in some detail how to define racial equity, envision racial equity, and we describe the guiding principles which make up a commitment to racial equity. I encourage you to check it out. Next. All right. We don't leave a commitment to racial equity to people with a good heart. Good hearts and warm bodies come and go. Goofy smiles and awkward handshakes come and go. Shifting political winds come and go. we legislate a commitment to racial equity because that legislation is durable and long lasting, unlike a goofy smile and an awkward handshake. Next. Here's my contact information in case anyone wants to reach me. Next. All right. We are not of the opinion that systems which harm us have a right to their own eternal existence. In that case, we believe in burning it down and building anew. One of my favorite people, Marlo Stanfield from HBO's The Wire, once said, "You want it to be one way, but it's the other way." Next. What happens when we turn on the power and equity moves like electricity through our homes, our streets, our neighborhoods, and our cities? Equiticity. Power plus equity is greater than. Next. Now turn on the power and let equity flow. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bai, for that amazing and powerful presentation. I'm so happy to be in this fight with you and continuing to bring racial equity in this transportation conversation. And, you know, folks, we will have some time at the end for questions for our panelists. So be thinking about those questions. Feel free to drop some in the chat. And when we get to the end, we can have this conversation. But before we get to the Q&A, I want to turn it over to our next presenter, Kyle Whitehead, who's the Managing Director of Public Affairs at Active Transportation Alliance. And Kyle will kick us off with some federal infrastructure conversation. So Kyle, take it away.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Obai, and thank you, Senator Simmons. Thank you to IEC, of course, as well for helping convene this session. So I'm going to try to break down what this federal infrastructure bill could mean for our state and for our region and why it's so important to racial and environmental justice. You can go to the next slide, Danny. First, a little background on who we are. So Active Transportation Alliance advocates for walking, biking, and public transit to create healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. And we envision a future where all people in Chicago have access to safe, convenient, and connected transportation. So we want to help give people transportation options, especially those other than driving or hailing a car, because we know those are really critical to meeting our sustainability goals and our equity goals. You can go to the next slide, Danny. So, you know, why is this important? How are transportation and environmental justice and racial justice linked? Transportation right now is the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions nationally and right here in the Chicago region. I think, you know, oftentimes that's not well understood and appreciated. We see lots of attention, lots of organizing power around the energy sector and coal plants and how much that needs to change. And you know, that is very much true, but we should be seeing just as much, if not more, attention to the harm that's coming from our transportation sector and what can be done about it, which is why, you know, we're so excited to be here today and have these types of conversations and have legislative allies like Senator Simmons and partners like Obai to work together on this fight and really make progress in our region. So, you know, right now, the situation isn't good. You know, the air quality is worse in low-income, majority Black and brown areas in both the city and the suburbs. You know, this is largely the south and west sides of Chicago, and particularly the southwest side and the south suburbs. And these are the same areas that lack quality transportation options. They lack access to safe, reliable, fast public transit. So when we're investing in sustainable solutions, we're advancing mobility and we're advancing sustainability for the areas that need it most. And that's really about, that's really what equity is all about, right? Wanting to invest more in the areas that need more and the areas that have suffered as a result of racism and discrimination for decades. And, you know, we're trying to begin to deal with some of that harm. Go ahead, Danny, you could move on. So I think everybody's probably seen something on television or in the media about this bipartisan infrastructure bill. President Biden signing it with Mayor Lightfoot and Governor Pritzker nearby. But I don't think that it's well understood exactly what this means for our region, what this means for our state, and how we can influence all this spending. So to give you some high level numbers, there's nearly $10 billion in this bill just for Illinois to invest in highway maintenance and expansion. There's about $4 million for public transit in Illinois. A lot of that, most of that for public transit in the Chicago region. So it offers a real opportunity to expand public transit and improve the transit that we have right now and to make it faster and more reliable and more sustainable as well. You'll hear from some of my friends later on about how we can electrify public transit effectively and quickly. There's also $1.4 billion in there to repair bridges all around the state. A smaller amount of money, but an important amount of money, $149 million for electric charging infrastructure. And this is money that's coming directly to the State Department of Transportation, and they can determine how to spend it. Then there's also billions more in federal funding that the region can compete for through a competitive grant program. So this is when the region is putting a project forward and competing against projects from all across the country. And the federal government, in this case, the Biden administration, is deciding which projects to fund and which projects not to fund. And the case we're trying to make to our transit agencies and to our region is when you are applying to fund projects that prioritize racial equity, that prioritize sustainability, you're much more likely to win those funds. And that's going to have a much more positive impact in terms of our goals in the Chicago area. Go ahead, Danny. So which projects should be prioritized? What are we talking about? We can start with what we don't want, right? What we don't want is more of the same, which is investments in roadway maintenance and particularly roadway and highway expansion. We know that when we expand our highways and when we build new roads, we are only encouraging more driving. And with that higher level of driving, we're seeing more pollution. And we're also further isolating people who can't afford to drive or aren't physically able to drive. And these people in the Chicago area are disproportionately Black and brown and low income. So these highway expansion projects, they come with huge price tags and promises to relieve congestion when we know that they don't relieve congestion and they actually cause a good amount of harm in terms of our EJ and racial equity goals. So, what should we be doing instead? What should a new approach focus on? And we and others really talk about focusing on climate change and racial equity and evaluating projects through those metrics. And when you're focusing on racial equity and you're focusing on climate change, you're centering the needs of people who walk, bike, and ride public transit. So when you're rebuilding a road, you're thinking about how you can make that road safer for people walking, how you can speed up the bus that travels on that road, how you could introduce a project that's going to make the street safer for everybody. And is there a potential to build a new rapid transit line on or nearby this road? A really good example in our region of something we think should be prioritized is the extension of the Red Line to city limits on the south side from 95th Street to 130th Street. This is really a travesty and a result of racist planning for a long time that the Red Line does not extend to the southern portion of the city, the far south side, greatly isolated and could really benefit from this extension project. Another good example is bus rapid transit, something we could see a lot more of in the city and the suburbs. For a relatively small amount of money, we could be speeding up our buses with BRT and getting all the sustainability and equity benefits that come with that. Go ahead, Danny. So that is what all we're going to talk about today. If you want to help us in this effort, please feel free to reach out. You'll see a photo right there of our biggest fundraiser of the year, Bike to Drive, Fifth Third Bike to Drive. It'll be on Labor Day this coming year. And shout out to Senator Simmons and his partner, who I know came out to Bike the Drive this year and had a great time. It's really a great way to experience the city, celebrate biking as a form of transportation and just a way to have a good time. So look forward to seeing Senator Simmons and more of you out there next year. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you, Kyle. I know we are getting a little behind time, so I'm going to move things forward a little bit. Brian, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk a little bit about air pollution.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. And thanks, Senator. And thanks to all the other speakers. I'm going to talk a little bit about air pollution, diesel, and public transportation. As the Senator mentioned earlier, it's kind of a very pertinent topic right now. How we're trying to get maximum benefit from the new technology that's available. Next. Who am I? Who's my organization? Respiratory Health Association has been a local health leader since 1906. We've been around a long time. We address asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, tobacco control, and air quality with a comprehensive approach looking to preserve lung health. Our mission is to prevent lung disease, promote clean air, and help people live better through education, research, and policy change. Next. So no surprise, Chicago is a big urban area. We're a national transportation hub. We're an economic powerhouse. There's a lot of industrial activity here. We have a sad and sordid air pollution history. We have not met U.S. health standards since they were first established in the 1970s. And we have made some progress on cleaning up the air. But at the same time, we found out that air pollution is more dangerous at lower concentrations than we previously thought. And as the science has come to the forefront, the federal government has actually tightened those standards. But it's still bad. Last summer, we saw 20 days where the air was officially unhealthy in the Chicagoland area. And this is largely due to us having problems with ozone, which is a main component of urban smog. It's a caustic gas, and PM 2.5, fine particulate matter, often called soot. And like I said, we've tightened those standards over time. There's currently an effort in Washington, D.C. to tighten them both further because the Trump administration basically ignored the science and decided not to tighten them in the waning days of the last administration. So we've learned more. It's more dangerous. We're going to get even tighter standards. Next. What do these pollutants do? Like I said, ozone's a caustic gas. When you breathe it in, it basically causes swelling in the insides of your airways, so they get smaller. For someone with asthma, you get a very hyperactive reaction. The airways in the lung get really tightened, and oftentimes there's mucus, which makes the airways even smaller. It makes it very hard for people to breathe. That's why they often wind up in the hospital or having to take medication. Fine particulate matter, small particles, large particles get filtered out by your nose and throat, the mucous membranes, you wind up swallowing them or sneezing them out. But the very tiny particles, which are way at the bottom there, the tiny little dot period on the slide, can actually make it past all those filters in your body and make it to the deepest portions of your lungs and actually get into your bloodstream as well. Next. So the effects of this, like I said, difficulty breathing, asthma attacks, ER visits, hospitalizations, heart attacks, premature deaths, and even lesser but widely extensive problems of lost days from work and school, more medication usage, more expense, more doctor visits as well. Next. And asthma is a serious problem in Chicago. There's over 200,000 adults in Chicago that have asthma. There's a big disparity in the percentage of the population that has asthma by ethnicity. You can see there for the Black residents of Chicago, the percentage is about 13.9%. For white, it's significantly less. And on top of that, if you look at Black children, they're 4 times as likely to go to the emergency room for an asthma attack compared to white children in Chicago. Hispanic residents, they're 70% more likely to wind up in the emergency room. These health disparities should not exist. Next. And so people have looked at what's causing it to be so bad? Why are these disparities out there? And both environmental organizations and the city of Chicago have both tried to tackle this, looking at what are some of the social determinants of people suffering from asthma, winding up in the hospital from asthma attacks. And they start to look at, access to medical care. They look at unemployment. They look at where the polluting industries are that people are exposed to. Where is air pollution worst? And you do tend to get that same thing that Kyle pointed out, concentration on the west side, south side, and other neighborhoods where these factors converge. Next. So when you talk about the CTA bus system, it's a great system. It provides mobility for all, provides for increased density and economic activity. It helps lessen traffic congestion. It operates all the time. It's a public fleet, centrally owned and operated. It operates in densely populated corridors. But that also means that it emits diesel exhaust, both local air pollution and greenhouse gases, precisely in those corridors. The string of pearls on the side could represent a string of train stations or bus stops, but those are nodes along a network. And the way transit works is you try and get as many customers as close to those bus stops as possible. So bus routes tend to roll along the most densely populated corridors in the city. But that also means that those people living in those corridors are most exposed to the diesel exhaust from those buses. Next. So in 2020, we partnered with the University of Chicago Center for Spatial Data Science, and we wanted to look at bus ridership for high and low ridership routes and compare that to lung disease rates in communities along those routes. So we looked at 125 bus routes and tried to get a subset of high ridership and low ridership, both high and low ridership and long length routes so that we got a good sample size. And then we looked at the areas 500 meters on either side of those routes as a buffer along those routes, which would be where the people who are living along those routes live. We took out census tracts that didn't overlap. But then we also looked at the areas precisely around the CTA bus barns, the bus garages as well. Next. Our findings were a little disturbing, but as you would expect, along those high routes where you're seeing over 20,000 people on a bus route, you're looking at an asthma rate that's about 8.4% higher than the city average. The COPD rate was at 10.5% higher than the average. And near the garages, where you can have literally hundreds of buses going in and out every day, asthma rates, COPD rates were even higher. And when we concluded the report, we looked at where are the areas that are most vulnerable, that have the highest number of people living along the routes, and we looked at a number of routes and said, these are the areas where we should probably start to phase in electric buses going forward, several of which go through the 7th. Next. So what does this all mean? We're not saying that CTA is causing an asthma disparity. There are a small number of vehicles. There's a lot of trucks on the road. But really, CTA serves everybody, and the people who live near the routes and ride the buses, that's what makes transit work. But because more of those sick people live along these routes and nearby these routes, electrifying buses could bring disproportionate benefits, i.e., cleaner air precisely where a higher proportion of people live with lung disease. So that's why we say it's a responsible policy for clean air, climate, environmental justice is the zero emission strategy for transit in Chicago. Next. And I'll pass it there.
Hi, my name is Susan Mudd. I'm with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. She, her are my pronouns. I'm really pleased and appreciative of being invited, Senator Simmons, and with my fellow panelists for this opportunity. As Brian mentioned, we are supportive, as are others on this call, of CTA electrifying its fleet. And I'm going to make the transition to electric school buses by saying that CTA serves many Chicago students. In fact, more than CPS does. But the students who tend to be served by CTA tend to be the high schoolers and the older children. The reason I'm going to be talking about electric school buses is because school buses tend to serve low-income young children, the children who are too young to be able to take CTA by themselves. And they also serve the other half of who CPS serves with its service tend to be students who need special services, often wheelchair access to a bus or other special needs. Next, please. Why are we concerned about school buses, and why are we urging that they be changed to electric? School buses in Illinois serve 1 million children. In the US, it's 25 million children a day, which is more than all other public transit put together. Children are more vulnerable than adults to air pollution, and a child sitting in the back of a school bus is exposed to 4 times more diesel pollution than a child riding in front of the same bus. Next slide, please, Danny. Brian talked about asthma. As Brian said, CTA is not causing asthma cases, neither is CPS, but these diesel buses, which are the predominant form of school buses in Chicago and elsewhere, are contributing to childhood asthma, which, as Brian pointed out, is the #1 chronic disease among US children now. And those who are in wheelchairs are subject to the worst, because the wheelchair access to school buses tends to be at the back of the bus, and it takes the longest to load and unload children in wheelchairs. So they're among the most vulnerable and being the worst exposed. Next, please, Danny. Electric school buses are now available, and this chart shows Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's figures on the reduction in greenhouse gases and the 2 pollutants that Brian mentioned, nitrogen oxides and fine particles, by switching from diesel to zero emission electric buses. Next, please. The other direction, please, Danny. Oh, keep going. Thanks. Okay. There are 2 other advantages to electric school buses. We can reduce student absences. Nationwide, it appears that students who are being driven in old, dirty diesel buses were losing 14 million school days per year nationwide. In addition to the air effects on their health, there's the noise level, which the children are being subjected to. We're already seeing that where there are electric school buses, the ride is quieter and children arrive calmer, as does the driver from that experience. Next, please. All major manufacturers of school buses now have electric models. Keep going, please. The problem is that electric school buses are about 3 times as expensive as new diesel. That's the upfront cost difference. So there's a problem at the upfront, which is how we pay for them on the upfront. Over the life cycle of an electric bus or electric transit or school bus, they can pencil out to be similar, and in the future, potentially less. But at the moment, the upfront cost is the barrier. The reason they can be similar over the lifetime of the bus is because electric buses have so many fewer parts, literally thousands of fewer parts. So there's much less maintenance involved. It doesn't mean no maintenance, but much less maintenance. And the fuel costs are significantly lower. Although we all think our electric bills are high, compared to the diesel prices, which are much more volatile and higher, there are big savings in the fuel costs, as is already being experienced in Michigan with the electric school buses that have been running there for a couple of years. Next slide, please. Keep going, Danny. I know we've got time. Many states, or every state, including Illinois, got money from the Volkswagen scandal settlement. Illinois got over $108 million. Next slide, please. Originally, Illinois, with the advocacy of many people on this call, dedicated some money to electric trains and electric buses, about 10% for electric school buses and some for public transit. Next slide. We were pleased that you can see on the right hand how that initial money was spent, portions of it. Next slide. This spring, we were very pleased when the Illinois EPA announced that all of the remaining money from the VW settlement, which is $88 million will be divided between electric transit and electric school buses, and then some for electric charging stations. We view this as really important in terms of equity. Public transit and school buses serve the very essential workers and children, and we view those as very important equity and populations to be serving, and should be getting the first monies that the state has. Next, please. This just shows a map of the priorities that Illinois decided for VW money, the red, yellow, and orange counties, and it's because of the historic ozone problem, which Brian alluded to earlier. So this is where Illinois' VW money will be and is being spent so far. Next slide, please. This is where the few electric school buses that have already been purchased in Illinois, where they are, to show you just that they're starting to get them, but we've got a long way to go because there's more money on the horizon, which I'll get to next. Next slide, please. This shows that there are utilities around the country that are starting to be engaged. Because of Illinois' new clean energy law, there will be money that will help with electric transit and electric school buses, and that money will grow over time. This just shows you that this is something that's starting to happen nationwide. Next slide, please. Utilities can play an important role here, and we are certainly going to be working with the others on this call to make that a reality. There will be new beneficial electrification plans that the utilities must adopt that will be helping with electric transit and school buses. In the interest of time, please go on. One of the reasons that school buses are so unique and can help fit with the utility grid and help with equity is that school buses, as you know, don't operate very often. In fact, over the course of a year, they're generally sitting around for upwards of 90% of the time. Those are basically, electric school buses will basically be batteries on wheels. Those batteries can feed electricity back into the grid, help with not having to generate more electricity, and instead feeding power back to the grid when it's most needed, such as in hot summer days. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Under Illinois' new law, there will be a goal of 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. Some of those should be school buses and transit buses and trucks that can help with equity. I mentioned the plans already. There's also going to be rebates for charging equipment, and there's plans so that we can grow this more in the future. Next, please. Lastly, I'll touch on something that Kyle mentioned, but specifically for the money in the infrastructure bill for electric school buses. There's $2.5 billion nationwide for electric school buses, another $2.5 billion for alternative school buses that electric can qualify for, and $7.5 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure, again, which could help both transit and school buses. There's also federal other legislation pending, but don't have time for that. So I think that's all my slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, for taking us through so many great information on electric buses. And I'm going to turn it over to Madison, who's going to talk a little bit more about the field and labor in actually getting electric vehicles on the ground and what that could mean for our workers. So Madison, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Madison Lyle. I'm the Transit Justice Organizer with Warehouse Workers for Justice, and I'm honored to be on a panel alongside each of the speakers tonight. So thank you to IAC and Senator Mike Simmons for bringing us together this evening. I'm going to share a little bit about our electrification campaign in Will County. WWJ was founded back in 2008 as a worker center to fight for good living wage jobs in Illinois' massive warehousing and logistics industry. You can go to the next slide. So we work and organize across Will and Cook counties, but my transit work is based out of Joliet, which is around an hour southwest of Chicago and home to the largest inland port in North America. This picture shows our national goods movement and how it flows through the Chicagoland and the surrounding areas. You can go to the next slide. So in Will County, there's over 500 million square feet of warehouse space. You can click, Danny, this kind of goes through, there we go. It's home to the 9th largest container port in the world. Next one, please. It is where 7 major highways intersect, where 6 of the 7 major railroads intersect. It's a day's haul from 60% of the continent. And so 3.5% of the entire nation's GDP circulates through Will County's port and warehouses every year. And this is what makes Will County extremely vital to the national logistics industry and a very strategic place for us to build power for workplace improvements. So this is the inland port. As you can see, it's pretty massive. And WWJ's Labor and Environmental Justice Department came out of the organization's long-term involvement in a local campaign here that's against a 3,000-acre expansion of this port, which you can imagine will bring even more unstable low-wage jobs and put tens of thousands of more diesel trucks on the road. So our Labor and Environmental Justice Department focuses on merging labor and environmental issues by using policies like electrification that'll bring justice, especially to Black and Brown port communities that are harmed most by impacts of environmental racism, while advocating for the investment in green infrastructure, which will raise labor standards across the supply chain. You can go to the next slide. This year, we've been on the ground in Will County talking to households along truck routes, truck drivers, and warehouse workers about their experience with toxic air and the warehouse industry. So here are a few pictures of some community meetings we had with local folks in the area. So I certainly applaud Senator Mike Simmons' support for equitable transportation policies because it's important that elected officials, companies, and governmental bodies which make and implement EV policies work with community-led organizations to create electrification implementation plans that really prioritize the needs of environmental justice communities and taps into that community expertise. For example, electric vehicle manufacturer Lion Electric recently announced that they're building the largest EV plant in North America right here in Joliet, which will begin production by the end of next year. And residents are concerned about what kinds of jobs that Lion will provide. These concerns are understandable given that the warehousing industry receives massive tax breaks to bring quote unquote good jobs to the community, only to have brought unstable work that left Joliet's working people in a revolving door of bad jobs in an industry that pollutes the neighborhoods they live in at the same time. And so Lion Electric has made no clear commitments to providing a just workplace. And as a worker center leading on environmental justice, we want to center the demands of the folks we represent who do want a commitment to high road workplace standards from employers. All to say, we cannot roll the red carpet out for any EV manufacturer or buyer without first demanding the health and safety of our essential workers first, because communities need clean air and family sustaining jobs. You can go to the next slide. This summer, our Environmental Justice Leadership Committee helped us host an event where we talked to residents and workers about what a good job means and electrification. And so here are some of the responses we got. Union jobs, living wages, local hire, medical benefits, paid leave, non-toxic workplaces. So when we say good jobs, these are the things we're talking about. All right, so this is what we want, but how do we get it? One way we're thinking about using electrification to uplift labor standards is by leveraging EV procurement plans. You can go to the next slide. To zoom out a little bit, these industries work in very complex supply chains. They are a mix of third-party logistics companies, temporary staff agencies, and subcontracting models that find their way around environmental impact monitoring and good labor standards. So these subcontracting models make it really difficult to keep track of emissions and hold parent companies accountable for their total emissions impacts. And it's important to recognize that these industries operate together as a system so we can adjust them as such. If companies are able to pollute our communities for the same reasons they're able to exploit our workers through misclassification and subcontracting, electrification is a viable way we can fix these problems. So you can go to the next slide. And so looking at the goods movement supply chain as a system, how do we use electrification policies and grassroots power to promote justice across the supply chain? We want to make sure that if companies are getting public money or if electric vehicle manufacturers are getting public subsidies to electrify, that those public monies are contingent upon raising labor standards and industry-wide improvements that include electric vehicle manufacturers, warehouse workers, truck drivers, port workers, et cetera. You can go to the next slide. So I wanted to end just quickly by giving folks an idea of programs we can think of that would put communities and workers through a just transition to electric vehicles. This is not a complete list, but here are just a few examples. So creating and retaining jobs that stimulate clean energy activity in the states, the use of community benefits agreements, community workforce agreements, and project labor agreements, providing students with relevant career technical education, responding to zero emissions technologies and infrastructure, and developing worker retraining programs to assist the existing workforce to upgrade their skills. So once again, this isn't a complete list, but and there are many other viable solutions that have been recommended, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stop there. Next slide. And I would love to invite you all to follow our EJ work on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to stay updated on how we are going to continue this fight for clean air and good jobs in Will County. So thank you all so much for your time and attention, and I will kick it back to Danny.
I would come with me. Thank you, Madison. Appreciate the insight on such an important piece. Like, there's a lot of good questions coming in the chat on electrification, and we'll turn it over in a second, but I would like to turn it back to the senator to close us out with some thoughts and to brief the conversation we had today.
Thanks, Danny. I think it's really fortunate that we've got so many just dedicated stakeholders and community-led organizations that are focused on just such a broad array of issues. And we heard some pretty good in the weed, granular background on everything from electric school buses to how we handle our environmental justice communities, looking at the effects of some of the damage in our environment on those communities, and taking it back to some of the systemic things that we all use, like buses, cars, and everything else. So I really appreciate that you all made the time tonight to do this. I'm really looking forward to hearing some questions that I know have been bubbling up in the chat. And I was going to say this at the end of the program, but in case I don't get a chance to, I want to thank the Illinois Environmental Council for co-hosting this entire opportunity with me. I plan to do a lot of things like this with the 7th State Senate District Office. This is a part of what it means to open up government and make it accessible to the people, and make my legislative agenda one that is directly driven by the community. And so I also want to ask those that are participating in the community tonight to follow each of these organizations on social media. I think I've checked, and just about all of you have active social media accounts on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. So I invite the community to get engaged with the work that they're doing day in and day out, and stay informed and stay activated in what they're doing. And then I also want to encourage you to follow me on social media. I'm at Mike Simmons on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And so that's all I'll say at this current time. And then maybe at the end, we'll do another closeout. So we'll take questions now.
Definitely appreciate the time, and we do have several questions that were asked in the Q&A portion. Andrea, you did a really good job really being thoughtful of some questions on biking that Kyle was able to answer. They were surrounding bike symbols, whether they're considered bike lanes, but I do want to bring up a question about legislation that feels pretty important right now, and something good to like close out on is, Ryan O'Donnell brings up the idea that CTA buses and CPS buses should be all electric, but what are some of the obstacles to achieving this? What legislative solutions are there? So Senator or anyone in the panel, if you guys have some answers to that, would love to bring it up.
I mean, I would say that the obstacles that I have seen, some would say that maybe the market hasn't quite caught up to where the demand is about to go for electric buses. So you look at things like parts, manufacturing. In some instances, it can take many months or many years to source the parts that are needed to produce those electric buses at the scale that we're going to need for big major American metropolises. But I'm also a big believer that the political will, if it's there, can make these things happen in a soon term. And so I think, in a place like Illinois, we've got, a lot of people that are on the right side of history on the issue, and that political will be there the organizations on the ground will be pushing for this, and I think if we have the political will, the market tends to catch up, and we'll see these things sooner rather than later.
I could just add on to what the senator just said. One of the things that's really in the news right now is that CTA is putting together. Actually has put together its budget plan for 2022 through 2026. And it looks like the RTA is going to approve that this week. One of the problems with that is that CTA wants to buy 600 more diesel buses. They have the money to buy that. They need up to 1,280 buses. They say over that same time frame, but they're only spending money on about 70, buying about 70 electric buses. So we expect that the CTA is going to come out with a bus electrification plan very, very soon that they've been working on for 2 years. And it should lay out basically what it's going to take, how long it's going to take, what the cost is going to be for fully meeting a goal of electrifying the CTA bus fleet. That being said, there's also a lot of funding sources out there in addition to CTA's own money. There's the Volkswagen settlement that Susan mentioned. There's infrastructure bill money that was just signed by the president. There's $39 billion in there for transit. It's the largest one-time funding for transit ever. There's probably going to be more money in the federal Build Back Better bill. And there's other funding from the big clean energy bill that was passed in Illinois. There's beneficial electrification projects where utilities are going to be required to spend probably starting around $41 million a year on building transportation electrification projects, including things like electrifying CTA buses.
Definitely. I will say that there are a couple other questions coming in the Q&A about EV infrastructure and also about just medium and heavy duty buses. And that kind of puts us into a good transition into our final ask of the night. Wondering, Senator, if you want to turn it over to talk a little bit about this.
To the, which question I had to?
The heavy duty vehicle MOU, I think we have an ask of our panel, our people here tonight. I think, no, sorry about that. I think Madison, would you mind taking?
Right, I think Madison was going to take that one. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So tonight we talked a lot about the world of electrification. And so we have a petition here telling our Governor Pritzker to sign on to something called the Medium and Heavy Duty Memorandum of Understanding Agreement, an MOU, which will get Pritzker to sign on to an agreement committing to putting 30% of new truck and bus sales to be registered to be zero emissions by 2030, and then 100% by 2050. And so this is a multi-state strategy that we would like Illinois to be a part of that will put us Illinois on a fast track towards putting these zero emissions vehicles on the roads.
Perfect. Yes. And I dropped a link to this petition in the chat. It is something that Warehouse Workers for Justice have been helping organize, and a lot of our members in this call have been working to get the governor to sign this multi-state memorandum of understanding. It is important to make sure that we're collaborating in this transition because, as we know, we are a United States, so we need support from all the other states around us to make sure that we are introducing electrical vehicle legislation that are going to help impact the long-term folks who are most impacting this. So the other piece to that is also the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule or Act. And this is all putting a bit of pressure on manufacturers to ensure that they're increasing their sales towards zero emission and medium vehicle duty. So really impacting the capital of the manufacturers of these vehicles to start adopting those standards. So by the time 2035 hits, we are getting closer to 100%. So there are some obstacles in the private industry. So we are looking to get our elected officials and our elected bodies, but also our governing bodies like the EIEPA to make sure that they are looking at these pieces of regulation to help us get our vehicles onto electric vehicles. So that is all we have for tonight, y'all. We had a really great conversation with everyone. If there are any additional questions that didn't get answered, feel free to shoot me an email at danny@ioenviro.org. I'll make sure to answer those. And if I don't have those answers, I have a lot of great people on this call and further partners to make sure we get those answers for y'all. But with that being said, thank you, Senator Simmons, for hosting us and allowing us to have a bit of conversation with you. And thank you to the panelists tonight for such a wonderful experience. With that, I'll let you all head out for tonight.
Let me also say before you all log off, thank you to a panelist again. Thank you to the community members that joined. When we come together like this, we keep our democracy alive. And so I want to, on that note, invite everybody to continue to be engaged, write letters to my office and to other state reps and state senators on these issues around conservation that are important to you, and stay engaged with the groups that are here tonight. They're doing absolutely the best work in this space. And the more of us that are engaged and are involved, the farther this work will go faster. So thank you so much for being with us this evening.